Welcome again to Nobody's Madness. I'm your host, Nobody. Today we're going to talk about conspiracy and conspiracy theory. For a long time, I've realized that I'm probably doomed to become a conspiracy theorist. The definition of conspiracy is a group of people that secretly plan to do something unlawful or harmful. And I think if you look around, you'll see that there's conspiracies everywhere. Some are a little bit bigger than others, but probably the most common one is advertising. Advertising is when a group of people sit down around a desk and conspire against us in the sense of how can they get us to purchase something that we wouldn't ordinarily purchase or that we don't need or don't want. And they try to figure out ways to trick us into wanting it or buying it. That's just one that's all over the place in our face constantly, every day, all the time. Now, conspiracy is one of those words that basically, I call it a trigger word. I'll go more into trigger words later, but basically they use it in order to get us to stop listening. As soon as you say conspiracy or conspiracy theory, usually a person just kind of goes blank afterwards and assumes that everything that follows is bullshit. It's just one of those little manipulations as a conspiracy. I think so. So this conspiracy of using trigger words to manipulate the way that we look at things or stop listening or just generally control how we perceive things is a pretty common thing. It's used frequently and created frequently through the news. You'll see them each using the same labels to describe certain events, and eventually those become a trigger word or a hot button topic. Triggers can either cause us to glaze over and not pay attention, which is a lot of what happens when we're in school, or they can be hot button words in the sense that once it gets brought up or mentioned, we become so enraged that we stop using sense and we just go off on tangents, pre-controlled tangents, instead of listening. We just get rooted into a certain stance instead of trying to see both sides of it. I've seen a lot of things that I would consider conspiracies, ranging from small to large. And like I said, I accepted the fact that I'm doomed to become a conspiracy theorist, a crazy conspiracy theorist at that. But before we go ahead and dismiss conspiracy and conspiracy theory, especially on the larger scale, when it comes to this country, which is the United States of America, there's quite a lot of conspiracy that goes on, and most of it is against us poor little folk. And before people decide that, oh, conspiracy theory is bullshit, blah, 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 our government wouldn't do that, I would just like to use one example to kick this off with conspiracy, and that's called the MK Ultra project. Do a little research, look into it. It won't take much. It's become pretty common knowledge. I'd like to use this as the go-to example of could American government do this or that? Could the American military do this or that? And if you refer back to MK Ultra, I think the resounding answer will be yes. Our government is capable of doing some fucked up shit. Like I said, do a little research on it. MK Ultra was a large project run by the CIA. Looking at the history of the CIA, you'll see some pretty strange things occurring, going back to when they were considered or named the OSS, which sounds a lot like the SS from the German Army of World War II, but they probably changed it due to the resemblance. But that was their title, was the OSS, and while they were the OSS, they basically controlled all funding and research projects, made all decisions on what projects would be researched, and controlled the funding for all psychology research from, I believe, 1945, and probably to this day under their new name, the CIA. MK Ultra started in, I believe, 1952, and this project lasted until the 70s, 76, I think, and after that point, again, my information is going to be a little skewed. I'm drawing from memory. I guess I can write it down. But check it, and you can verify. Don't nitpick me because my dates are off or whatever. Don't be, a high school history teacher. I'm giving a generalization, and you can verify the facts and look it up for yourself. But roughly from 1952 to like 1976, the MK Ultra project was in full swing. Now, they eventually got discovered, and the project was revealed, and people had charges pressed against them. They were sued, lawsuits, rewards, including, I guess, one military personnel that wasn't allowed to sue until laws were changed in like 2000 something, and then he was finally able to sue. But what we know about MK Ultra comes from this big reveal and the supposedly punished people that were involved, which I'm sure looked good on paper, but in reality ended up being very little punishment. Why? Because they were funded by the government. But that's besides the point. So what we know about this project has mostly to do with LSD and the influx of LSD into this country. Why? Because they experimented a lot with it for mind control purposes. It seemed promising at one point in time for use in interrogation and probably just overall brainwashing, but after a while they abandoned it. Now, the dubious research that they did using LSD and the methods that they used to test it and observe subjects included prostitution houses, whorehouses as fronts, where they would get people to come in and then they would dose them with LSD while they were with the prostitute, and then they would observe their behavior, and then if they realized what was going on or found out about it, they were then blackmailed because they had gone to a whorehouse, and therefore they didn't want anybody to know, and the CIA could say, look, you say anything about this and we'll tell everybody you were visiting a prostitute. I'm sure your wife will appreciate that. That's pretty dirty pool. I guess it's their own fault for going to a whorehouse if you want to look at it that way, but it's still pretty manipulative and pretty bad. So the people that were running MK Ultra were aware of the fact that they were about to get busted, okay? So during the time frame that they had between the tip-off and getting busted, they basically went through and destroyed as much evidence as they could. What survived mostly is the LSD testing that is widely available on the internet. Go ahead, look it up. It's horribly entertaining. So my question to you is, if they were aware and they started destroying evidence, and all that remained of 26 years of their experimentation, well 24 I guess if my time frames are right, are about, I think I read, between 5,000 to 20,000 documents, okay, covering not just the LSD practices, but other forms of mind control that they tried to do, and some pretty terrible things. But my question is this: if they knew somebody was coming, were they going to start by destroying the most incriminating evidence or the least incriminating evidence? I think most people are going to go to the worst stuff first to make sure that gets wiped out, leaving the less incriminating stuff available. So if that's what you would do, if you were, if you were trying to hide evidence, you would get rid of the stuff that would incriminate you the least, or incriminate you the most. Then if what we have left is the last thing they got to, wouldn't that mean that was the least, and therefore what they destroyed was substantially worse than the information that got saved? And that's what I'm proposing here, is that what we know about MK Ultra is probably the least of the terrible stuff that they did. Which begs the question, what did they feel impelled to destroy immediately versus what they allowed to leak out, or versus what they couldn't destroy in time? That's a pretty foreboding situation right there, if you think about it. I know some of the other documented conspiracies, for instance, was the FBI's poisoning of moonshine in the 1920s during Prohibition, well, 30s, I guess, for Prohibition, which that killed 400 people. So is our government capable of doing terrible things? And we could say, oh, but that was the old United States. That was the old government. Our government wouldn't do that now. That is just a foolish way of thinking. If anything, they learned their lessons from these previous experiences and moved on to bigger and worse things. If you look into MK Ultra, you'll probably also find references to Project Monarch, and Project Monarch is another conspiracy theory, and it's riding on the idea that it was born from MK Ultra. So MK Ultra was discovered, and then it went underground even further after discovery, and so began Project Monarch. I've read a little bit about Project Monarch. Project Monarch has to do with using brainwashing to create Manchurian candidates, which, if anybody's familiar with this election for Donald Trump, which is done and over, and I don't know, they're still probably talking about it and waiting for him to pop out. But the idea is that Project Monarch is creating Manchurian candidates. It's creating sleeper spies and sleeper assassins and this and that, including using entertainment industry people to brainwash us, although that's probably closer to the truth of it. But reading it and the methodologies, if you read through it, you'll find some discrepancies with it. It starts to sound a little fantastical. However, given the track record of our government, it's very possible. It just doesn't seem like an effective method. Some of the methods include using Disney movies to create triggers in people. The reason I find that a little dubious is because if you're using Disney movies, which are pretty much playing at some point in time, somewhere around you, there's Disney music, there's Disney movies playing, you could accidentally hear a Disney movie in the car next to you as the kids are watching it in the back seat now. It seems like a poor trigger. Seems like an effective method to brainwash, but a poor thing to have as a trigger because it's all over the place. And that's where some of the fault comes from. So the idea is to use common things to induce brainwashing, and sometimes they talk about split personalities, where you hear the trigger and you become somebody else. If this was so present in the media, it would seem a little, it would seem like people would be getting triggered all the time. It'd have to be a little more complicated than what is indicated, so it makes it seem a little crackpotish. But some of the information that gets put out, particularly on conspiracies that seem more true, you're going to have a lot of disinformation, information that resembles the accurate truth, but then starts to deviate into more insane and ridiculous ideas. These are created, and there's been YouTube videos, there's information out there about how the CIA, FBI, and other government bodies, I'm sure, are creating false information directly through the internet now. I mean, there's like a guy sitting in an office whose sole purpose is to create fake websites to debunk or make, not necessarily to debunk, they're not going directly against it, but they're creating artificial conspiracy theories, and taking true conspiracy theories, ones that, well, true conspiracies, and making them sound like ridiculous theory. And hopefully I haven't lost you at the word conspiracy, at the words conspiracy theory, and you stopped listening, but I think if you look through MK Ultra and you look at the basic idea of it being a method of mind control using modern day media, I think it becomes quite clear that it's not to make individuals into weapons or assassins or triggers. I think that the idea of the project is actually more along the lines of just a general brainwashing of the American people, period. It's one that makes us more docile, it's one that makes us more consumer-driven, and maybe docile is not the right word. It's one that, because it can make us docile, and I think when I say docile, I mean oblivious. I mean putting up a wall. So when somebody says conspiracy theory, we glaze over and just ignore everything that's said after that, no matter how true it may actually be. As soon as you tag conspiracy to it, eyes glaze over and you stop paying attention. So in one sense, it makes us wall out the truth or the potential truth by using trigger words. Two, it can be easily used to drive us towards consumerism. And three, it can be easily used to set us into a panic, all of which basically stop us from thinking rationally. Say hi to the cat. And this, I think, is more insidious and more effective than having a single assassin or a sex slave or whatever other individual control that they're talking about. I think it's much more likely that Project Monarch is more in our face and more obvious than we give it credit for, because some people can scream until they're blue in the face that something is happening and nobody will listen to them because it's just a little too far outside of our little wall that we have built up. Not trying to, quote Pink Floyd too much with the wall thing, but we definitely have this little bubble, and if it doesn't fit into a piece, of our bubble, then we tend to ignore it. But the media is just so obvious of an example of that sort of manipulation, where they just hammer us with an idea over and over and over, and after 9/11, the codes of the color code for the terrorist attack and how much they were just yanking us all over the place without any real information. I mean, they were just kicking it from, there was never a green, and once Bush left office, there, disappeared, but like, the media stirs us into a frenzy. I recall recently there was that whole clown situation going on that was after 6 months of scary clowns creeping around and attacking people and kidnapping people and this and that. It influenced people enough that they weren't going to dress up like clowns for Halloween, because there were literally a sense that people were going to shoot any clown that there was on site, that people were afraid to go out on Halloween as clowns. It was just a made-up frenzy, and it was driven completely out of sync by social media and the news, and it was quite obviously just a fabrication. The pictures that were used were fabrications taken from movies, taken from that, but social media kind of started it, and then the news picked it up and carried it on and stirred up the pot of terror. They do this also with racism. They do this with, obviously America's the greatest country in the world, so it's easy to just make every other country look like an enemy to us. You spout patriotism, and we're instantly on the bandwagon, even if it's getting behind something that's completely unpatriotic, like an unjust war or attacking the wrong enemy, which just look back over the last 20 years and you'll see that happen a couple of times. So like I said, I'm doomed to become a crazy conspiracy theorist, and my go-to point for justifying that is Project MKUltra. So I will be talking about more conspiracies involving education, involving racism, and involving the system of control of wealth in this country, which is a huge conspiracy theory. Healthcare, you name it, I'll probably end up talking about it. Aliens and whatnot. So MKUltra, look into it. It's horrific, and the information that's available on MKUltra is probably the least bad, the least dangerous, the least awful of the things that were done during Project MKUltra. If you want to get another inkling of it, the show Dark Matters, if you can find it, I don't know if it's still on the air, if they're still doing stuff, but they go into a few mind control projects, both by MKUltra and by other scientists that started off in the United States during that time frame, which means if they were working in the United States, during that time frame, they were working and doing psychology projects. They were working for the CIA. They may not have known it, but the funding was coming from them and all the research was going up to them. So they cover a couple of issues in Dark Matters, and there's some pretty interesting stuff in that show that will get you to think about the lengths that humanity has gone to study things in some cases and to control the population. And I'll probably be going back in time to methods that the Romans used and compare it to methods that we're using today, because things haven't really changed all that much. Any large governed body is going to use some control to cover up the bad things that they're doing, because any large governed body is going to have people at the top doing things that are wrong. Why? Because there's people at the bottom doing things that are wrong. And if it's at the bottom, it's at the top. And it's just as simple as that. If you have a large organized body of people, I hate to break it to you, anarchists, but if you have a large body of people, you need a government. You need some system of information and basically a chain of command. It makes it easier to function as a unified body. And whenever you have that, because of our state of humanity, where we're at in our evolution and growth, you're going to have corruption. You know, and it doesn't matter which government it is. You're going to have corruption. So I don't know where I'm not sure exactly where I was going with that, but we will look at the past and we will look at the present, and like I said, looking at MK Ultra, it's revealing of what our government is capable of, and I assure you, they did not stop, they just got better. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.